Welcome to my talk, Faces and Places, a guide to better travel photography. My name's Jacob James and I'm a travel photographer and Panasonic Lumix ambassador. I started travel photography around 9 years ago, and up until pretty much the last 6 months or so, I've been traveling probably 2 to 3 months of the year, maybe sometimes up to 5 months of the year, depending on which year. As you can see, I started out using the Nikon DSLRs with the trusty D40 actually, all the way back in probably early 2000s. And then I started my professional career using the Nikon D7000, and then I transitioned pretty much within the first couple of years of my professional career into using Panasonic, first with the Micro Four Thirds system, and then onto the S series in the last couple of years as well to kind of complement it. I also founded a travel workshop company called Intrepid Exposures. So again, when COVID's not happening, we run workshops all around the world teaching people travel photography. But hopefully in the next kind of 10, 15, 20 minutes, I will run you through this presentation, hopefully give you a few tips on how you can kind of take your images from more snapshot travel images to kind of high-end professional documentary photography, which hopefully has a little bit more impact. And I'm going to give you a few of the kind of lessons that I've learned on my journey in photography. So if you haven't seen my work before, my work base is based around mostly people really. I call it kind of cultural documentary. So I photograph pretty much anything when I'm traveling, but it tends to have a focus on humans, cultures, the kind of things that we have in common, and also the differences we have. And also occasionally photos of cats because, if you're on Instagram, hashtag cats will get you at least 20 extra likes. So let's dive into the presentation. So as I said, we're going to look at how we can create travel images with impact. So I think the first tip really I have is learning how to use light. I think one of the main points I want to push on about light is that there's no good light or bad light. So a lot of people always say to shoot at golden hour, and I think that's great for making kind of magical images like this. But sometimes shooting earlier on in the day can actually create harder shadows. So this was probably shot around 2 in the afternoon, and what I like about it is the dramatic light. Because it's not sunset, you've actually got these deeper crushed blacks, and that really accentuates the ruggedness and the harshness of this landscape, and really sold what I wanted to picture of the landscape in Kyrgyzstan. One of the things I do a lot when photographing people is I try to make sure that they're close to a window when they're inside. And what this allows you to do is get this nice fall off of light from across the face. So if you remember what I said about the inverse square law, closer the subject is to the light source, the faster the light falls off. What this does is it allows the subject to be kind of picked out of the frame and really highlighted, particularly in areas like this in Romania where a lot of people are living in old traditional houses. The issue you've got is if the subject is further away from the window, then the difference between them in the background tonally is reduced, and it can sometimes be hard to really accentuate the subject. Again here, this is probably the middle of the day, and this was in Bulgaria, January, probably 2 or 3 years ago now. It was actually -30 outside, and these guys were still working. But what I wanted, again, as with the landscape from Kyrgyzstan, I wanted that really strong interaction of light and shadow to kind of show the ruggedness of the job they were doing. So I think the main takeaway point is there's no good light or bad light. It's using light to tell the story you want to tell. And you can often do this by using faster lenses. So I pretty much shoot with primes 90% of the time. And the reason I do that is because I like to shoot in low light situations. So this was in Myanmar, one of the first trips I took actually, travel photography trips. And this was lit just by a single small spotlight that was actually off in the distance. And it actually lit up these, but I think this was probably shot around f1.4. And I think there's a lot of ambience to be had in these low light scenes. Again here, this one was shot in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and the only light source in this entire scene was a tiny row of candles that if you can just see in the subject's right eye, you'll just see them there. So the entire scene is lit by a few candles, which were probably 2 or 3 feet away from the subject, so the light levels were super low. And so this required me to shoot at a 1.2. I was shooting on the Panasonic GX8 at the time, so I was using the Nocticron 42.5 1.2. So it gives me equivalent of an 85, but with the light gathering ability of 1.2, and that really allowed me to shoot in this almost pitch black scenario. As well as light, I think the other really, really important component of a great image is color. And I think color can both add contrast and take away contrast. And one of the easiest ways to understand color is to look at a color wheel. So the beauty of a color wheel is that you can see which colors add contrast with each other and which colors take away contrast. And the way that we can actually do that is by looking at what we call complementary colors and analogous colors. So in this image, you'll see that we've got blue in the sky, we've got some green on the church, and then we've got orange and yellow in the foreground and also some red. And if we go back to this, what we can see is that orange, red and yellow, green and blue are almost on opposite sides of the color wheel. What that means is it adds contrast. And so in a situation like this where the light is actually quite flat, having that complementary color actually allows us to add contrast and pop in the image. So if we make it black and white, what we can see is there's almost no contrast. If we make it back to color, we can see that the color is actually adding contrast. And so I often shoot early mornings in cities and also late at night in cities, because there's often this transition period just as the sun's coming up or just as the sun's going down, where the street lights are still on, but there's color in the sky, often like a pinky or a blue color. And it's this kind of contrast with the yellows and the warmth of the especially older style street lights, with the blue and the purple in the sky, which I think really, really works for city shots. Knowing how to use these complementary colors is really useful in situations where you have nothing else to work with. So I was shooting this parade in Bulgaria, which is the Kukuri, and these guys are basically really old tradition to scare off bad spirits from the villages. Happened just after, well, around Christmas and up to the New Year kind of time in a lot of Eastern Europe. And the day I turned up to this parade, it was at a kind of municipal sports facility made out of concrete. It had snowed, but the snow had melted. It was grey sky, it was raining a little bit, basically terrible weather. And I was really getting nothing. I was feeling really kind of deflated, and I had to kind of walk around the area, and I saw this blue wall. In my head, I was thinking maybe I can use the blue as kind of an offset color. And then I saw these guys come past with the red, and as soon as I saw that combination, I knew that this image would work. So I just asked them if I could shoot the portrait there, and I think this was the best, probably the only image that I got from that day, but it's one that I really love. So as well as kind of color and light, you've also got exposure as, I guess, one of the points in triangle in that you learn about and you try and understand when you're getting into photography. But a lot of people learn how to correctly expose an image, how to balance ISO, how to balance shutter speed, how to balance aperture. But we never really taught how to use it creatively. And I think often sometimes hiding things in images rather than correctly exposing them can actually create better images. Now, using silhouettes is a really good example of that, the human eye and the brain is really clever. We don't need to show the whole subject of this girl to know that it's a Japanese lady in a kimono, because we're so used to seeing this kind of shape and form. But also you can use light and shadow to also hide distractions. So often if I'm shooting on the street early in the morning, what I'll do is I'll actually push the exposure down. So whereas the parts of the image which would be my highlights normally, I'll move them down to kind of my midtones. And what that does is that moves my midtones down to my shadows, and my kind of lower end midtones to shadows into black. So what it does in a situation like this is it hides kind of distracting things like bins, rubbish, wrappers, all these kind of clutter that you see on the street, and it just focuses your eye on the faces of the subjects in the scene. Again here, just using the same technique, just knocking the exposure down, just creates an interesting pattern, adds a bit of mystery to an image which otherwise would be really quite boring. I think once we've kind of got the basics of light and composition, light and color and exposure, the next one is kind of, I guess, the craft of taking a picture. And I think many of us, when we photograph people, we get very shy. I'm quite a shy person. And so we tend to step back and zoom in. And now this is part of the reason that I use prime lenses, is because it forces me to get closer to the subject. So I tend to shoot with a 15mm lens on Micro Four Thirds system, which is equivalent to about a 30mm, 35mm on full frame. And what that means is that I have to get really close to the subject. So in these images, I'm probably touching distance from the subject, but what having that wide lens does is it actually makes the image feel immersive. It makes you feel like you're in there. Whereas when you use a long lens, it can often feel kind of disconnected, like a kind of voyeuristic view, rather than one where the viewer of the photo feels like they're in the scene. I think one of the other things that people get tied up on about is composition. I think we're all taught about, rule of thirds, putting a subject on the third line, and I think that's great if you want to create a balanced image. If you want an image with nice subject, nice background, feels kind of harmonious like this, that's perfect. But sometimes when you want the subject to be the main focus, like this photo of my little sister, put them in the middle of the scene. Other times you might want to put them offset, and you can actually use objects within the frame to lead to the subject. And I think what composition is all about is just about taking the viewer's eye on a journey. So the rules are there to help you create simple images, but I think about the frame from the viewer's perspective. What do I want the viewer to look at? And here I wanted the viewer to look at this mum. And so by using a wide angle and just turning the camera slightly, I've accentuated the lines of a bus train, and really kind of drawn the eye to him. But also play around with the composition, look for patterns. Like, this is not the greatest image ever, but I was playing around and I noticed the similarity between the tree and the marking on the guy's sleeve. Or here with this young man and his mum, I was looking for the pattern and the symmetry in their movements. And these little extra things can just add that extra little dollop of something special into your image. Also, repeating lines tend to work really well in landscapes, but what I found is you also want a kind of an adjacent line that kind of helps to break the tension and create a really nice looking scene. And also look for foreground, midground and background as well. Often photography is a kind of 2D medium, it's flat, but we want to give the impression of the depth in the image, and often just having layers of people or layers of landscape or just a clear foreground, midground and background in any shot you're doing will really help to sell that sense of depth. And we can also sell that sense of depth by framing the subject with elements within the image. So here, for example, in the streets of Tokyo, I noticed that every time he got to the chorus of this song, the people would raise their arms and would create this nice kind of guiding line towards the girls who were singing. And so it was waiting for that moment where the arms aligned and you got this nice interaction, but all the arms became leading lines, leading the viewer to what I wanted to show them. Same here, using the people's heads and their movement to guide towards the man in the middle. And I guess that leads on to the idea of seeking kind of unique angles or viewpoints. I think travel photography in general is oversaturated with nice images. How many photos of the Eiffel Tower have you seen? How many pictures of the Taj Mahal have you seen? How many pictures of Mount Fuji have you seen? So when I went to Mount Fuji, I was actually pretty amazed that the actual town of Fuji was incredibly industrial. And I'd seen all these beautiful pictures with temples and lakes, which is the other side of Fuji. But the reality of this side of Mount Fuji was actually industrial. And so I wanted kind of my image of Mount Fuji and my image of Fuji as a place to kind of encapsulate that. And so I found this bridge over the highway, which had this amazing view of the kind of industrial factories with Fuji in the background. And I just waited until the sun was just catching the snow on the top of Fuji, just to kind of make it pop in the scene and kind of create an image which told my story of my impression of Fuji. And also using drones is a really great way of doing that now. They're becoming more and more common, more and more accessible, but there's probably thousands of pictures of this church in Bulgaria. Almost none of them were from this perspective. And that's because there's nothing there. It's impossible to stand in this spot. So by using the drone to kind of fly around, it gave me a whole new perspective on this place, which is quite touristy, and allowed me, to create an image which hopefully had not been seen before. And I think the last thing I want to touch on is don't be scared of embracing movement. I think real life is dynamic, it's fast, it doesn't stand still. And I think with photography, we're often worried about showing blur, showing movement. But in this particular image, the guy was dancing in a kind of almost trance-like state. And I wanted to convey that. So I just used a slower shutter speed and I tried to move the camera with him to get a little bit of kind of detail with him so it's not completely blurred. But just trying to sell the sense of what was going on in the moment. Same here with the cars racing through the streets of Osaka. I just panned the camera with the car to get that feeling of rushing through the nighttime. And I think all of these images, if they were static, would just not sell the emotion and the feeling of being in that place at the time. And lastly here, this guy who was working in the tannery in Fez in Morocco. I wanted to just add a tiny little bit of movement in the hide and in his arm, just to give you a sense of the motion he was making, because I think if that was completely static, it would look awkward, but by adding a little bit of motion, a little bit of blur, it really gives you a sense of the action and the work that he's doing. So thank you for listening. I hope that was useful. I believe there's a Q&A coming up. If you have any questions, feel free to jump into the Q&A or drop me a message on Instagram at JacobJamesPhoto, and I'll be happy to run you through that. If you found any of this interesting, I have an ebook online. If you go to intrepidexposure.com/travel ebook /travel-ebook, it's free to download, and I think you'll find kind of lots of interesting things in there about how to create better travel images and hopefully recap some of the things that we've covered. Thank you for listening.